Well, first of all, my name is Rafael Bocino. Nice to meet you all. I gotta say I'm slightly scared of this crowd. I wasn't expecting that many people. When I came here, it was empty too. I saw how many chairs we had. I thought, yeah, maybe half is going to be full. I can handle that. I'm not sure if I can handle this, but I'll try. I promise I'll try. All right, so Wesley already broke the news, and hopefully you know why you're here. I'm going to talk about how you should and shouldn't use AWS Step Functions. Yeah, I could go over the agenda here. It's pretty much me telling my story, telling you about my challenges, and all the really dumb things that I did, what I learned, and hopefully, whenever you leave this session, you are going to be on a better position than I was when I started, right? That's my goal. My goal is that you take some learnings here, and whenever you go and build on top of AWS Step Functions, that you don't need to go through the same challenges that I did, right? Because you're smarter than me. All right, so who am I? Like I said, my name is Rafael Bocino. I am, officially my title is Manager Cloud Partner Strategy. Have you ever seen a manager that doesn't manage anyone? That's me. So, but honestly, what I do is I'm a builder, right? I'm a builder. I build on AWS. Whenever I'm not busy with my customers, I'm busy trying to build something new on AWS, right? That's I know it's weird, but that's my concept of fun. So that's what I do. Like Wesley said, I'm also an AWS community builder, which I'm not sure if applications are still open. I need to check with Wesley, but it was up to a few days ago at least. If it is, you should apply. Is it open? Okay, I saw somebody answer. And I'm also one of the leaders for the AWS user group in Dallas. So if you were here for the previous presentation, the speaker talked about the AWS user groups. I'm almost sure there is an AWS user group nearby you. Check it out. Go to meetup.com, search for AWS. I'm sure you're going to find a really nice community around you. Okay? When my wife makes me leave the computer, you can find myself going on hikes with her, playing with my dogs, cooking, and watching soccer. But I didn't mention I'm Brazilian, so of course, if my TV is on, I'm watching soccer. Okay, but you don't care about me, you care about AWS Step Functions. You didn't see my name and you came to the session. You saw the title, right? So this is a story of challenges, learnings. I was a lot of failure for sure, a lot of frustration. But again, if everything goes well, as soon as we finish this session, you are going to take my frustration and use it to build better in AWS Step Functions. Before I start, how many people here have used AWS Step Functions before? Okay, maybe half. Just to make sure, how many haven't used AWS Step Functions? Yeah, okay, so it's about half. Okay, just checking. My math is good. All right. So what was my problem? Or to be more specific, my customer problem. I had as you can see here, we have two workflows. Let's start with the first one. Two flows, sorry. I had this architecture where whenever an object was created on S3, whenever there was a new object in my bucket, it would trigger a Lambda function that would generate a pre-signed URL and send that to a queue. And that's it. It was something really simple. It was part of a larger architecture, but that was the key thing here, right? But a customer came to me and said, that's all and good, but actually, I need this, not just for new objects as they are created, I need that for every single object in my bucket that already exists there. So instead of on demand per object created, it would be just once for all objects. Simple, really simple. I changed my Lambda to, it would generate a list of all the objects, and while there was an object that it didn't generate a pre-signed URL for yet, it would, and it would push the queue. Then it would go back and check again. Is there an object? There is. Generate, send to the queue. Oh, there isn't? Done. Problem solved. But of course, it isn't, because that's an AWS Step Functions session, and I'm not using AWS Step Functions here. And what happened was timeout. By the way, I know that you know that there wasn't supposed to be this meme here, right? You got one. It was supposed to be another one, but copyright issues. We couldn't have Oprah here. So yeah, that's the meme that we had for today. Stock images, beautiful. Cool, so I got a timeout. Who ever had a timeout in Lambda before? Yes, what is the max timeout for Lambda functions? 15 minutes, yes. When I had a bucket with enough objects on it, I would hit that timeout. That was my issue. Well, finally, AWS Step Functions, yes, you're in the right section. I'll read that one with you, just to make sure we are all in the same page, okay? AWS Step Functions, it's a low-code visual workflow service that developers use to build distributed applications, automate IT and business process, and build data and machine learning pipelines using AWS services. So if you go back to my problem and look at the highlighted words that I have, match made in heaven, right? That's exactly what I needed. So I always wanted to play with AWS Step Functions. I never found the right excuse, but I did. Thank you, customer. So I was I was really ready to do it. Then I'm going to speak a lot about workflows. We're going to see a few workflows here. Workflow also has a really defined definition on AWS Step Functions. So I'm going to read that with you as well, just to make sure we're on the same page. Workflows manage failures, retries, parallelization, service integrations, and observability, so developers can focus on higher value business logic. Again, highlighted words, parallelization and service integration. Now, instead of doing one by one, when I saw that, I realized, wait a minute. On top of not having the timeout failure anymore, I can make it in parallel. So I'm going to do it faster, right? I'm going to be able to deliver and faster than ever. Perfect. So let's go to AWS Step Functions. Workflow, audience, workflow. Okay, that's on the workflow. And my workflow was really simple. I used AWS SDK and optimized integrations to integrate my workflow with a different service. So if you check AWS Step Functions documentation, you're going to see that there are over 200 integrations that are native, that you can just actually drag a box to your Step Functions workflow and start using it, right? So it was really simple. List all objects on my bucket. Then I enter a map state. A map state is pretty much for each on a loop, right? But in parallel. Okay, so a map. If you're used to map reduce, a map, right? So for each object that I have in my bucket, I'm going to run that Lambda that I had, where it generates the pre-signed URL and send to the SQSQ. Okay, so that's helpful. That's exactly what I needed, right? And problem solved. Yay! No, it worked well until it didn't, because that's a 30-minute session and it's been only 10 minutes. Of course, there are more challenges. So it worked out until it didn't. And that's my tip number one for you here today. Okay? Tip number one is pagination. If you ever use an API, you are probably familiar with the concept of pagination. If you're not, think of a cake, right? You want to eat the entire cake. Who doesn't? But you need to go a slice at a time, right? That's pagination for APIs. Whenever you need the entire cake, you need the entire list of objects in a bucket. The API, the AWS API, is going to return a subset, the first 1,000, if I'm not mistaken. If you have more than 1,000, you need to request the second page so you can keep going through your objects, right? So tip number one is you should know that that integration doesn't paginate automatically for you. And that was my challenge. It worked really well up to 1,000 objects. My customer wasn't happy. They had more than 1,000 objects in their bucket, right? So we need to change the architecture. Second attempt, I changed it slightly. Instead of using that native integration that wasn't paginating by itself, I wrote a Lambda function that was really simple. Get a list of all objects, and I will paginate inside that Lambda function, and then I'm going to return a list, an array, better saying, of the objects, and have the exact same map state after that, right? So again, it was replacing the native integration with a Lambda function. Do you think that worked? No. Why not? Don't you trust me? I couldn't hear you, but we can chat later. Sorry. Yeah, no, you're right. It didn't. You shouldn't trust me. It worked again until it didn't. Okay? Hopefully you also recognize the original meme here. The challenge now was something that I couldn't believe my own eyes. There was an error that said that I hit the error message was exactly this. The execution reached the maximum number of history events, 25,000. Who here was aware of that limitation? Okay, I see a few hands, nice. So those that didn't raise their hand, you just learned something new. Step function has this limitation documented, okay? If you go to the documentation, which I didn't initially, I would know that there is a limit to 25,000 executions inside of one workflow execution, right? So whenever it's navigating through these events here, then there's for each one, it cannot go over 25,000 text executions inside of your workflow. But AWS also documented how to work around that limitation, okay? So I read their documentation, and they have 3 different strategies. By the way, when I went through this problem, there were just 2 different strategies. There's a new one released in December of 2022 during reInvent last year, which is map state in distributed mode. That helps, but it also brings some other limitations. I won't talk about this just because I haven't played with it yet. Okay, so I recommend you, if you want to take a look, to go and do it. But let's discuss the other 2 strategies here, okay? One is use a Lambda function that can start a new execution of your state machine to split ongoing work across multiple workflow executions. So pretty much, whenever you're about to hit that 25K, you stop the execution and start a new execution from where you stopped. So in my case, if I went to X amount of objects, I would stop because it's about to hit 25K, and then start a new execution from X minus however many objects I processed already, right? And another strategy is start a new state machine execution directly from the task state of run execution, which is pretty much what I did. What does that mean? And we're going to see here in detail. I took my step function and I broke it down in 2 different step functions, all right? The first one now is really, really, really simple. the same Lambda function to list all objects, but instead of starting a map stage to go over each one of them, I instead called a different workflow, okay? So this one would never hit the 25K. It would be just a few events because there is the start, there is my Lambda being executed, the result, just a handful of events here, okay? And then my second workflow, it's a little bit more not complicated, but more complex than the other one, all right? So it would be, remember, it would be triggered with a payload with all the objects that I have on a bucket initially, right? And what it would do is it would separate the first 500, right? It would take the first 500 objects of that array. Then in parallel, it would do two things. Let's focus on this first one. The first one is exactly what I had before, but just for 500 objects. So the map would just go in parallel through 500 objects and do I call it here scan object, but that's exactly what we had before. Pre-signed URL generated and pushed to a queue, all right? But here's the fun part, the interesting piece. It would, at the same time that was happening, this was happening. It would have a choice state. A choice state is pretty much an if statement, right? It would check, okay, I removed the first up to 500. Are there any objects left in this list, in this array, sorry? Oh, there are? Okay, let's start a new execution of this workflow where all the objects that are part of the payload are all objects minus the first 500. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and that would go on until at some point, this choice state here would find out that there are no objects left, and then it would pass, which is pretty much lead us to end. And that would end the execution of my workflow. Do you think that worked? Yes? Yeah, that's a solid strategy, right? It should work. Can anybody see a problem? No? Okay, so that makes me feel better about myself because I couldn't see either. And it was fine until it wasn't. And why wasn't it? Yes, I see your smile. This payload is too big for this Lambda function. Have you ever had this issue where you're trying to execute a Lambda function with a payload that it just doesn't execute because the payload is too large? If you haven't, you just learned something new again. Lambda functions, asynchronous AWS Lambda functions, and step functions have a limit of 256 kilobytes for the payload. Remember, the payload was my array with all objects in a bucket. Not the object content, just the keys, right? But if I had, again, if I had a bucket with enough objects on it, it would be large enough, my payload would be large enough that it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. Yeah, it wouldn't work. I had to breathe. Okay, why? Let's see, documentation. Again, documented workaround. AWS actually makes a suggestion to you for whenever you feel like you may have a payload that is large enough, okay? And the strategy here is really simple. Don't pass payloads around. Save your payload on an S3 bucket as an object and pass references to those files around, okay? Don't pass your payload, save your payload on a bucket and pass a reference to that object in that bucket, okay? So really important. And I did that, and do you think that worked? We're almost at the end of the presentation, so it did. So yes, finally, I made it work. Well, I finally made my customer happy. Yeah, of course, that was the goal the entire time. But I actually wrote about this problem, well, this challenge that I had, this presentation is based on a blog article that I wrote. And somebody commented on that blog article. And their comment was really simple. It was just, why don't you use S3 batch operations? No, I didn't know about S3 batch operations. It was released in reInvent 2018. I was there, and I missed it. So if I actually had used S3 batch operations, I would have been able to do what I did easier, cheaper, and faster, right? I was trying this entire time, even though I didn't know it, trying to reinvent the wheel. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. All right, we're coming close to an end, so I always like to do this summary, right? I see a few people, eyes closed, not so energetic anymore. Maybe you had a big lunch. I had a salad, so I'm mostly okay, but I get it. So if you're sleeping, no hard feelings, we're still friends. We can connect on LinkedIn, we can go play soccer together, not a problem. But if you haven't paid attention so far, this is the time to pay attention for the summary, okay? Pretty much a collection of my own failures, if you want to call it like that. Read the documentation. RTFM, right? Yeah, I know you thought about that. Read the freaking documentation. All challenges that I hit throughout this process, and you can go back to my slides, I always have a slide right next to it saying, this is documented, right, on AWS documentation. So that's on me. I didn't read the documentation. I didn't. I was excited about it. I couldn't wait to get my hands dirty, and I started building without actually learning. And that's okay. That's a way to learn. But and I learned a lot throughout this process. But I also made my customer wait more, most likely, right? So read the documentation. Tip number one here. Oops, I'm going to break this TV, I'm sure. Second highlight here. AWS Step Functions is an amazing way to orchestrate serverless applications. So for those that haven't played with AWS Step Functions before, please don't let my not so great experience make you go further away from trying it out. It should be the opposite, right? You already learned all these struggles that you potentially would go over. Now you don't need to go anymore. If you haven't tried it out, please do. I can guarantee you're going to see a customer problem that you have that you can solve with this service. Okay? Remember, and I saw some people taking note, AWS SDK doesn't offer automatic pagination, which is fine, but you need to be aware of that. Work around that limitation. Cool? 25K is the limit of historic events in AWS Step Functions, right? Yes, pictures, yeah, I'm going to get outside of the screen. Don't forget about this, okay? I promise you, if you have an execution that is long enough, this is going to happen if you don't work around that, right? So please do. And if you go and try to use distributed maps that was released, reInvent last year, let me know. I haven't used that yet, and I would love to learn from you. I mean, it's my turn to learn something from you. Both step functions and Lambda functions, async Lambda functions, have the payload limit of 256K. Don't forget about that as well. Even if you're not using AWS Step Functions, that is important. Use S3 buckets to store your payloads and pass S3 references around, right? I don't remember if I mentioned that before. Read the documentation. read the documentation, but not just the AWS Step Functions documentation. Make sure they're following what's new. Make sure to connect with your local AWS user group community. Make sure to follow blogs from people that are building on top of AWS. Because, again, that wasn't me. I was reinventing the wheel. If I knew that AWS S3 batch operations existed, maybe we wouldn't have this conversation today. So that's a plus, I guess, maybe. But honestly, no offense to you, I really wish I could have delivered my solution to my customer first, even if that meant we wouldn't get to know each other here, right? So make sure that you read documentation, you follow what's new, and connect with the local community. That's pretty much it. I would like to thank every single one of you. It was a really interesting journey that I was super excited to share with you. Hopefully, just hopefully, you learned something new here today, and whenever you go and try to build with AWS Step Functions, you don't need to go through the same challenges that I went through. Thank you so much. I'll be right next here to talk to any of you if you want to have a conversation. Thank you. You're awesome.
All right, give it up for Raviel.
Woo!